Welcome to Rewatch-and-Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode before ranking each episode against each other. And today's episode is Criminal Minds Season 1, Episode 9, Derailed. Episode in a nutshell is a brief reminder of what happens in the episode. So this episode is very contained as far as locations are concerned. So it starts with Elle on a train, and that train is then taken hostage by a man with an imaginary friend who is obviously mentally ill and believes that the government has implanted chips into his arm. Because of his mental illness, the BAU is called in, and that's when they realize that Elle is a hostage on the train, and they work with him and the standard hostage negotiators to try to have the hostages released. Unfortunately, because of his mental illness and specifically his imaginary friend being in his ear, they aren't able to negotiate the hostages. So Reed reveals that he can do sleight of hand magic, and so they decide to fake taking a chip out of his arm in an attempt to free the hostages. And then Reed goes in alone. He fakes removing the microchip, and at first things seem to be going well. However, the imaginary friend urges Ted, who is the mentally ill man, to basically not let the hostages go, not let Reed go, starts to try to convince Ted that there are multiple chips in him, whereas before he only said one. Reed, realizing that he has an imaginary friend, starts to feed into his psychosis and uses the information he knew because prior to becoming mentally ill, Ted was a renowned doctor studying string theory, and so Reed uses these facts to his advantage to basically make Ted distrust his imaginary friend, Leo. And it does end up working to a certain extent as Leo does start to back off, but then he starts to get confused, and this is when Elle takes her chance to knock him into the window, and then one of the other passengers happen to have a firearm in his briefcase, and he ends up shooting Ted, which puts the incident to rest, and everyone is removed from the train. Those who need medical attention are sent for medical attention, but nobody ends up dying. And that's essentially what happens in a nutshell. Is a train is taken hostage. There's some ups and downs, and then it's resolved. So now that we've been reminded about what happened in the episode, we'll now rank the episode. And as always, we'll be ranking first on the mostly objective ranking list using set values to determine the score. And while it is void of motion, bias and judgment can still apply, which is why it is only mostly objective. And then we have the personal ranking list, which is entirely subjective and is based on my personal opinion and the entertainment value I personally felt the episode had. For mostly objective rank values, we start with this one because it was such a contained setting. The same characters that were supporting characters in the episode pretty much had a role to play the entire episode. And so we start with 1 point each for Theodore Breyer plus his imaginary friend Leo. Then we have Linda Deaton, who is Theodore's psychiatrist doctor. Elaine Curtis, who is a pregnant woman from a small town, going to the big town to get to, well, she says take care of it, but I think most people would know what that means. Josh Patel, who is a delinquent who got drunk, crashed his car into a university, basically got kicked out of his house because his behavior was not acceptable. Harry Anderson, who is the one with the briefcase who ends up shooting Theodore or Ted. who is a salesman who had been married 18 years, no kids, and recently his wife has decided to file for divorce, and so she went to Texas, so I guess he's following her, which brings to mind, what was that gun for in a show like this? But, and then lastly, we have Agent Frank Moretti, who is from the other department that standardly handles the hostage negotiations, which again, the reason the BAU was called in on this particular case was because of the mental illness of the hostage taker, Ted, whereas usually Frank Moretti would have handled the hostage situation start to finish. But that brings us up to 6. Then we have our multi-season main character developments, and the first one is Elle being taken hostage on the train among the other hostages, and actually being the trigger because Leo sees her looking at a folder and that she's FBI, therefore of the government, therefore somebody who may be monitoring Ted and his microchip and following them, hence what started the whole situation in the first place. That's worth 4 points. And then also we learned that Reed can do magic tricks and apparently has been practicing them during exams back in his childhood when he went to school. And it ends up working out because he uses the sleight of hand to fake removing a microchip when Hotchner takes a microchip from one of the walkie-talkies so that they can make it look legitimate. But that's also worth 4 points. However, there were negatives to this episode as well. The first is -2 for negative messaging or behavior, and that is acting against advice/orders, and this has to do with both Reed. When he goes in, they warn him, do not take off your vest, get out of there right away, neither of which he ends up doing. He does end up taking off his vest, and then he ends up being stuck with the rest of the hostages, essentially meaning now 2 agents are taken hostage because he doesn't leave right away. And then some of the hostages, despite like Elle saying like, sit down, be quiet, don't do anything, keep wanting to do things. You know, the doctor, obviously, she knows his condition, she's helped treat him, so she tries to talk to him, and sometimes it works, and other times, well, she ends up shot too. You know, then you have Josh, who just keeps egging on the keeps egging Ted on. Yeah, you're right, the government sucks. Yeah, we're all being surveilled, dude. It's like, shut up. Shut up and sit down. Bringing me to my next one is the weaker dislikable supporting character, excluding characters meant to be disliked, and I really hated Josh because I mean, like, if you're a hostage on the train, the last thing you want is some random Yahoo to start egging on the person with the firearm that could harm you and everyone else around you. Like, sit down, shut up. Just, you know, if I would have put myself into the shoes of literally anybody else on that train, oh, I would hate him. I would hate him so much, and I do, as an audience member, also greatly dislike him. It was just, I mean, I understand for plot purposes, it raises the tension and the drama, so I get why they would have such a dislikable character as one of the hostages, but that doesn't make them any less dislikable, even if they serve a purpose. So I am taking 4 points for that because terrible, terrible character. That's also, ironically, the delinquent character, so right off the bat, from like moment we meet him, we know he's bad news, and then he just behaves badly, and there's like no redeeming quality to this character, at least that we see on screen, which again makes him very dislikable. And I guess on the one hand, them doing that maybe meant to make him dislikable, but typically I would consider in a hostage situation, the person we're meant to dislike is the hostage taker, not one of the hostages, which is why I'm still taking the 4 points. And then the episode was semi-memorable, so when I first started watching it, I was kind of like, I don't recall this, and then as it progressed, I was like, oh yes, now I remember this. And semi-memorable episodes are worth -2 points because while they are memorable, they're not right away memorable. And that leaves this episode with a 6. And so our season 1 ranking so far in our mostly objective ranking list has Extreme Aggressor, Natural Born Killer, Compulsion, The Fox. This episode comes in 5th place, Derailed, then LDSK, Plain Sight, Broken Mirror, and currently last place is Won't Get Fooled Again. Okay, and then my personal ranking, well, honestly, this is the episode I liked best so far. There were some frustration with that one character, Josh, but otherwise, I thought it was a really interesting um, episode. I like that it was a very contained, like, setting and characters, so there was more opportunity to become attached to people and to the scene taking place. Because it was so contained, it also was less action-based and more building up of the tension, having to kind of plot and counterplot, um, or anticipate and counter-anticipate behaviors. I like that the main perpetrator in this case was someone who didn't have bad intentions, because like when you follow serial killers, they usually have bad intentions. In this case, he's mentally ill. He's having a bit of a break, and it wasn't necessarily Ted. Ted seemed like a bit of a pushover, and that's why his imaginary friend Leo was able to make him do all this stuff. And it was his imaginary friend Leo who really was the bad guy. Um, and Josh, we don't like Josh, obviously. But overall, I felt like the plot ended up being very engaging. The tension was built really well, like with wanting to see what happens, wanting to see, what happens. And like I also like that they did follow through a bit, like rather than everybody getting out unscathed. Um, Josh ended up with a head wound. I think that was his own fault. Um, then we had um, the Elaine had to be held at gunpoint to speak on the phone initially to Gideon when he first arrives. So that obviously would be terrifying for her. We had Linda, the psychiatrist, being shot. Um, the security guard who comes in when the train initially stops, which we learned from the security guard telling Elle the reason the train stopped in the first place was because somebody committed suicide by jumping in front of it. Um, and then he ended up killed like immediately at the start of the episode. And then, at the end, Ted ends up being shot by Harry, the salesperson. So they built tension and they did have a lot of wounds, and that helped to build the tension even more because you weren't guaranteed anyone was getting out of the hostage situation alive. It could have had a bad end where it was just, the FBI agents getting out. I mean, it probably wouldn't be, but there's a universe that exists that could have happened, or even like Eller Reed could have been injured as well. Um, Overall, like I said, like it did a really good job of holding attention, building tension, and also being entertaining and engaging. So I really did enjoy this episode, though, like I said, I'm not overlooking the flaws, which is why I decided to give it an 8 out of 10 ultimately. I also do like um, when Reed's going in to do the sleight of hand. First, Morgan wants him to teach him how to do the sleight of hand so he can go in first because he doesn't want to let Reed go in. Of course, Reed refuses because it takes a long time to become really good at sleight of hand. And then as Reed's about to go in, he asks the group of Gideon, Aaron, and Morgan to do him a favor. And when they ask what the favor is, he asks for just one of them to look at like they're going to see him again, basically telling them like, stop looking like I'm about to go and die. that was a good moment in the show as well. Anyways, I got sidetracked again. It was an 8 out of 10, and that puts Derailed in first place so far, followed by Compulsion, Plain Sight, Extreme Aggressor, Natural Born Killer, The Fox, LDSK, Won't Get Fooled Again, and in last place so far for me is Broken Mirror. And then we have our series rankings so far. With this episode, season 1 on the mostly objective ranking is at a score of 53 out of a possible 220, and the personal ranking so far is at a score of 39 out of a possible 220. But with that, we've now rewatched and ranked Criminal Minds Season 1, Episode 9, Derailed. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.